He worked the graveyard shift at the downtown Federal Building, same post for 15 years. Never said much beyond evening and have a good night. Wore a simple uniform, carried an old flashlight, and walked his rounds with the precision of a metronome. The younger guards joked he was probably some wannabe cop who couldn't make the cut. What they didn't know was that the small ribbon pinned inside his jacket pocket was the Medal of Honor, and the man who earned it had been declared dead in Afghanistan 23 years ago. Welcome to the Honor Stories. Before we begin this powerful tale of sacrifice, silence, and recognition, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe heroes walk among us unnoticed, hit that subscribe button. These stories need to be heard. The Whitmore Federal Building stood 12 stories tall in downtown Denver, its glass facade reflecting the city lights long after the business day ended. Inside, security was handled by a private company that hired mostly former military, former police, and college kids looking for steady overnight work. The lobby was marble and chrome, designed to impress during daylight hours, but at night it became a quiet cathedral of echoes and shadows. Frank Holloway had worked the midnight to 8 shift for exactly 15 years, 4 months, and 12 days. Not that anyone was counting except Frank himself. He arrived every night at 11:45 p.m., signed in with the same careful handwriting, and took his post at the main security desk without fanfare. His uniform was always pressed, his boots always shined, his radio always tested twice before his first round. The other guards knew very little about him. He was maybe 60, maybe older. Gray hair kept military short, weathered hands that never shook, and eyes that seemed to see everything without looking directly at anything. He drove an old Ford pickup, lived somewhere on the north side of town, and never called in sick. Ever. "Frank's like a ghost," said Martinez, one of the day shift supervisors. "Shows up, does his job, disappears. Never complains, never asks for overtime, never even takes his full break. Reliable as sunrise, but quiet as a cemetery." The building housed federal offices, Social Security, Veterans Affairs, Immigration Services, and a few others. During the day, it buzzed with activity, but at night it belonged to Frank and whoever was working the other shifts. Most nights it was just him and Torres, a younger guy who handled the loading dock and parking garage. Frank's routine never varied. First round at midnight, checking every floor, every office, every emergency exit. Second round at 2 a.m. Third at 4 a.m. Final round at 6 a.m. before the cleaning crew arrived. Between rounds, he sat at the main desk, reading paperback westerns and drinking black coffee from a thermos that looked older than some of the other guards. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then, kept it brief. Evening. All quiet. See you tomorrow. The younger guards had long since stopped trying to draw him into conversation. It wasn't that he was unfriendly, he just existed in a different space, like he was present but not entirely there. One cold February night, everything changed. It was 1:30 a.m. when the elevator doors opened, and 3 men stepped into the lobby. They weren't supposed to be there. The building was closed, locked down, no scheduled maintenance or cleaning crews until dawn. Frank's hand moved instinctively to his radio, but he didn't key it yet. Training kicked in, observe first, react second. The man in front was tall, maybe 45, wearing an expensive suit despite the late hour. Military bearing, confident stride, the kind of presence that commanded attention. Behind him, 2 younger men in dark clothing, both scanning the lobby with professional interest. Not tourists. Not lost businessmen. Frank stood slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Gentlemen, building's closed for the evening. Can I help you with something?" The lead man approached the desk, pulling out his identification. "Colonel James Morrison, U.S. Army. I apologize for the late hour, But we need access to the VA offices on the 7th floor. Emergency review of some classified files. Frank examined the ID carefully. It looked legitimate, but protocol was protocol. Sir, I'll need to verify this with my supervisor and the VA administrator. Even with proper identification, after-hours access requires advance authorization. Colonel Morrison nodded, seemingly impressed rather than annoyed. Of course, you're absolutely right to follow procedure. Security protocols exist for a reason. He paused, studying Frank's face in the lobby's soft lighting. Have we met before? You look familiar. Don't believe so, sir. Frank reached for the phone to make the required calls, but Morrison held up a hand. Wait. The colonel stepped closer, his eyes narrowing slightly, not with suspicion, but with recognition. What's your last name? Holloway, sir. Morrison went very still. Behind him, his two companions noticed the change in their superior's demeanor. Frank Holloway? Yes, sir. Staff Sergeant Frank Holloway, 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. Frank's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. Years of carefully maintained civilian casualness fell away, replaced by the bearing of a soldier. That was a long time ago, sir. Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then slowly came to attention and saluted. His two companions, recognizing the gesture's significance, followed suit. Frank looked uncomfortable. Sir, that's not necessary. I'm just security here. The hell you are. Morrison's voice carried a weight that made the lobby feel smaller. Do you know who I am, Frank? Colonel James Morrison, like your ID says. My father was Captain William Morrison, one of 1st Airborne. September 15, 2001. Forward Operating Base Chapman, Afghanistan. Morrison's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Ring any bells? Frank's face went pale. The years seemed to fall away from both men as they stood in the quiet lobby, 23 years and thousands of miles from a moment that had changed everything. Jimmy? Frank's voice cracked slightly. Little Jimmy Morrison? Not so little anymore. The two men stood there, the weight of shared history settling between them like fog. Finally, Frank spoke. Your father was a good man, best officer I ever served under. He's alive because of you. Frank shook his head. He's alive because he was tough, tougher than any of us knew. Colonel Morrison turned to his companions. Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet a genuine American hero. Staff Sergeant Frank Holloway, Medal of Honor recipient. The man who saved my father's life and the lives of 11 other soldiers when their convoy was ambushed in the Somali Plain. The two younger men looked at Frank with new eyes, seeing past the security uniform to the soldier beneath. Frank shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to be anywhere else. Sir, with respect, that's ancient history. Your father and I, we did what we had to do. Nothing more. Nothing more? Morrison's voice rose slightly. Frank, you carried my father 3 miles through enemy territory with a bullet in your shoulder and shrapnel in your leg. You called in air support while performing field surgery with a combat knife. You held off an entire Taliban squad with just a sidearm while the medevac landed. They declared you KIA when they couldn't find your body after the extraction. I wasn't dead. Just took me a while to get back to friendly lines. 6 weeks. You were missing for 6 weeks. The army gave up looking after the 3rd week. Dad never stopped believing you were alive. But the rest of us, Morrison trailed off. When you finally turned up at Bagram, they said you refused the medal ceremony, refused the promotion, refused everything. You just wanted out. Frank nodded slowly. I'd had enough. Wanted to come home, find some peace. And you've been working security ever since? It's honest work, quiet work. Morrison looked around the empty lobby, then back at Frank. Dad's been looking for you for 20 years. He's retired now, lives in Colorado Springs. He talks about you all the time, about the soldier who saved his life and then disappeared. He doesn't owe me anything. Neither do I, but I'm going to tell him I found you." Morrison pulled out his phone. "Unless you object." Frank was quiet for a long moment, then shook his head. "I suppose it's time." The phone call was brief. Morrison stepped away, spoke in low tones, then returned. "He wants to see you. Says he's been waiting 23 years to buy you a beer and thank you properly." "I don't need thanks." "Maybe not, but he needs to give them." They talked for another hour in the quiet lobby. Morrison explained his father's recovery, his retirement, the family he'd raised because Frank had made it possible. Frank listened mostly, occasionally correcting details or filling in gaps from his own memories of that terrible day in Afghanistan. As dawn approached and the building began to stir with early arrivals, Morrison prepared to leave. "Frank, I meant what I said about Dad. He'd be honored to see you again. But I understand if you prefer your privacy." Frank was quiet for a moment, then pulled something from his jacket pocket. It was small, wrapped in faded cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a military ribbon, the distinctive blue silk with 13 white stars of the Medal of Honor. "I never wore it," Frank said quietly. "Never felt right about it. Your father and the others, they were the real heroes. I just did my job." Morrison stared at the medal, then at Frank. "You know what Dad told me once? He said the real heroes never think they're heroes. They just think they're doing what anyone would do." "Your father said that?" Every time someone called him a hero for surviving, he'd say, "I'm not the hero. Frank Holloway is the hero, and nobody will ever know his name." Frank carefully rewrapped the medal and put it back in his pocket. "Maybe it's time they did." Morrison smiled. "Maybe it is." The next week, a small ceremony was held at the Denver VA hospital. No media, no speeches, just a group of veterans and their families gathering to honor one of their own. Frank wore his dress uniform for the first time in over 2 decades, the Medal of Honor finally in its proper place on his chest. Captain William Morrison, now retired and gray-haired but still strong, stood before the man who had saved his life and wept openly. "I never got to thank you properly," he said, his voice breaking. "I never got to tell you what you gave me. My son, my grandchildren, all of it exists because you wouldn't leave me behind." Frank, uncomfortable with the attention but accepting it with grace, simply replied, "You'd have done the same for me, maybe. But I didn't have to find out, because you were there." The ceremony was small, but word spread through the veteran community. Frank found himself invited to speak at schools, at veteran events, at ceremonies honoring forgotten heroes. He accepted some invitations, declined others, but always maintained that he was just a soldier who did his job. He kept working security at the federal building, but now his colleagues knew who they worked alongside. The jokes stopped, replaced by respectful nods and genuine appreciation. New guards were told Frank's story as part of their orientation, not as gossip but as inspiration. Torres, the younger guard who worked the loading dock, asked Frank one night why he'd kept his service record secret for so long. "Because," Frank said, "the moment you start believing your own legend, you stop being the person who earned it in the first place." He still worked the midnight shift, still walked his rounds with military precision, still read his westerns and drank his coffee. But now, occasionally, visitors would stop by just to shake his hand, to thank him for his service, to hear a piece of history from the man who lived it. Frank never told the complete story, never glorified the violence or dramatized the heroics. When pressed for details about that day in Afghanistan, he would simply say, "Some stories are better left with the people who lived them." But late at night, in the quiet lobby of the federal building, he would sometimes touch the ribbon in his pocket and remember the weight of carrying a wounded officer through enemy territory, the sound of helicopters finally coming to take them home, and the knowledge that sometimes doing your job means everything to someone else. Colonel Morrison visited regularly, often bringing his father. The three men would sit in the lobby during Frank's break, sharing coffee and quiet conversation. No war stories, no rehashing of old battles, just three soldiers who understood that some bonds transcend time and circumstance. Frank Holloway never became famous, never wrote a book, never sought recognition for his service. He remained what he had always been, a quiet professional who did his job with honor and dignity. The only difference was that now, a few people knew the true measure of the man who guarded their building through the long, dark hours. And sometimes, in a world that often forgets its heroes, that's enough.